Hello, my name is Daniel. The Air Force has been generous enough to label me a Master Sergeant, but in this context, that doesn't, or at least shouldn't mean anything. Nothing that I say is representative of any institution or reflects anything but my own views and opinions. The following 20 or so minutes are going to be an adaptation of a speech I gave for the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum annual conference in October 2022. I've been thinking a lot about how humans organize in social systems. It's part of my field of study as a student of sociology, but it's also been on my mind now for the last 17 years. I joined the Air Force in 2006 and found myself immediately labeled a component of this massive bureaucratic machine, told that who and how I was in this machine was directly related to the rank I wore in the Air Force specialty code I'd been assigned as a Chinese linguist. From day one of Air Force basic training, I saw this pattern of labeling, categorizing, sorting, organizing human systems by predetermining the role that each person in that system would play, starting with the selection of dorm chief and element leaders at basic training. Our social systems in the military are almost exclusively built on this premise and pattern, and a social operating system that runs primarily on blame and punishment. Your role in the system dictates what we can blame and punish you for. In tech school, at the Defense Language Institute, I became a student leader, a rope, an agent of the institutional system. I felt compelled to take on that role because I really wanted to make more money. My wife and I had 2 young children. On my uniform, in addition to my rank, was this yellow rope that told everyone around me that I wasn't really one of them. I might as well have worn a name tag that said narc or something. It changed the dynamic somewhat. My relationships changed to both my fellow students and to the military training leaders who were NCOs. When you're wearing a rope in tech school, you feel an increased distance from your peers. And then the NCOs, who are normally kind of grumpy and scary, they get a little warmer and nicer. Your fellow ropes become your clan. It's like being magnetically charged one way or another, repelling or attracting these alternately polarized factions. More sorting, more separation, increasingly bucketed and pigeonholed. After tech school, I went and worked for this other massive bureaucratic agency with a highly institutionalized culture, and I really didn't like working there. Once again, I felt sorted and stifled and unexpressed, just a scientifically managed cog in a Taylorist machine. It was like being on an assembly line. And 2 really important things happened there. I developed relationships and friendships that helped me stay sane in this highly rigid institutional environment where I constantly felt like I didn't fit. And these relationships allowed me to express the expansive extent of who I was and the multitudes that I contain, but extended beyond my institutional designation. And I pursued small innovations in an effort to do something that felt even the tiniest bit more meaningful to me. Sometimes taking a task that felt pointless and reducing it from 12 hours of work to 1 hour of work was about as meaningful as it got. Making improvements to our processes and solving problems was a path to increasing my coherence between who I was, what I needed, and what it was I spent my time doing. I realized that I could always feel like my efforts were meaningful so long as I was either in pursuit of doing more good stuff better or putting a stop to what anthropologist David Graeber called bullshit jobs. During this period, I grew increasingly alienated from those who felt most aligned with the institution and increasingly close with my peers, with whom I would escape our nest of cubicles and wander the halls, childlike, making one another laugh, and supporting each other in our institutional alienation. Most of those people left after just one enlistment. I think often about what kinds of people stayed, or how those who did stay might have had to alter or suppress themselves in order to survive these narrow confines. For most of my career now, I have alternated between being praised and being punished for attempting to bring my work and my sense of self and value and meaning into alignment. I have had leaders who guided and protected me, and leaders who really didn't appreciate my angst and idiosyncrasies, and my often tactless, ruthless pursuit of doing more good shit better and less bullshit. These efforts put me in direct conflict with that operating system which had predetermined my role and was primed to use blame and punishment to ensure I served it. For someone like me, all those little aspects of demanding conformity and staying between the lines and shutting up and coloring, the demand to align with the institutional minutiae, can really get in the way of getting well aligned with the real value of the institution, which can and often does serve an important function. For me, there was always a clear connection between bringing my whole self and achieving excellence in all I do. You want excellence? Improve the interface between the human and the task. Give them the why, and let them tell you how they uniquely are ideally suited to get after it. Include their voice. Create and hold space. Well, the Air Force didn't really do that for me most of the time, so I pursued innovation to create space for myself. And because I'm a particularly disagreeable type, I tried to compel them to incorporate my voice. I started writing about my lived experience and what I was reading about culture, leadership, and innovation. I wanted to share the things I was learning as I strove to create space for my odd self and my family whose needs didn't fit the affordances of the status quo. Also, I was crying out for some connection, the kind I felt when I was wandering the halls of that cold institution with connected others, really needing to find those I knew must be out there, fighting to do more good shit and less bullshit, looking for that space where I could safely transcend my pre-designated role. Being a digital native and at this point not having a great network of local peers, I started blogging, first on Millbook, and then on a personal blog, and in LinkedIn articles. And then someone invited me into the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum, where Project Gutenberg helped me get my first piece published in Strategy Bridge. Finding Deaf was like this revelation. It was this group of people who were all trying to do more good stuff better and cut the bullshit. And there was this shocking lack of that thing where institutional roles dictate how you will be received. They were bringing their whole selves to this space. Nobody wearing their ranks or letting their designated roles dictate how, why, or whether they engaged with others. These people became important to me because of how they impacted and enabled me, because of their relationships with me. You know how I opened with that thing about becoming a rope in tech school, and suddenly the relationship between me and my peers changed, and suddenly the MTLs stopped being so mean and scary. You know how I talked about that first assignment after tech school and how my relationship with my peers changed and grew deeper as we sought to support one another in a highly oppressive environment? And my relationships with leaders varied wildly depending on just how severely they were institutionally socialized and how much they internalized the threats of shame and blame if they failed to fulfill their designated institutional role of shaming and blaming those who don't fulfill their designated institutional roles or extended outside the standardized affordances granted for appendages like families. Here, it was like we could finally interact and share and be vulnerable and open, and it wasn't like if someone outranked me by a couple of grades, which they often did, they felt compelled to mentor me when I expressed frustration or temper my anger or whatever. I bring this up because when I go, I'm having the most difficult time, and a leader reverts to mentoring mode, it's like this transparent focus on trying to get me back to functionality for the sake of the institution. I'm not talking to a human being anymore. They're just an extension of that institution, which, sure, has a vested interest in me not burning out, but alienating. I'm not going to talk your ear off about complex systems except to say this. A crucial difference between ordered and complex systems is that what matters most in ordered systems is the roles of nodes and agents, but what matters most in a complex system is the relationship between nodes and agents. So like in a car, you've designated the alternator to be an alternator, and so long as it's doing the alternator thing, whatever that is, that's what matters. You're not like, yeah, but how do the battery and alternator feel about one another? Are they close? Is there trust there? Is the alternator being a bit of a timing belt recently? But in complex systems, relationships between nodes are the most important thing. And when people focus too much on roles, it hurts relationships. In the institutional setting, relationships were heavily constrained by institutional roles. Leaders didn't properly lead, ironically enough, when they adhered too strictly to their rigid, compliance-oriented roles within the institution. What got me through wasn't the institution succeeding at ensuring I got through. It was relationships with people who were capable of transcending the institution and their roles and operating kind of outside the lines. Complex systems operate on a basis of relationality, not seemingly rational, predetermined roles. When I got to Hawaii for my next Air Force assignment and felt that community connection, that relationality lacking, having just left my innovation support group I had grown to depend on so much while in DC, with a very active Agora run by amazing folks like Jen Savada and Heather Price, Jer McCoy, and others, fostering a type of relationality that enabled us to bring our whole selves and transcend institutional constraints. I knew immediately that we needed a deaf Agora in Hawaii, so I helped stand one up. And the focus wasn't primarily on making these nodes aware of the roles that other nodes were institutionally configured to play. It was about fostering relationships between people so that they could create the conditions for emergent and unexpected things to happen, about holding space for them to find and express their individual voices, to make this less of a machine and more of an ecosystem. I started my facilitation journey around the same time that I found deaf, introduced to practices like human-centered design, design thinking, and think wrong. For a brief time, I was in an organization where the institution granted me space to practice and grow and start making a difference. Facilitation granted me the capacity to enable people to transcend their designations, their ranks and job titles, and navigate complexity in effective ways by holding space for lived experience, empowering their voices, enabling divergence and relationality. And then I was off to another assignment, and suddenly found myself as a lonely facilitator and design thinker inside an institution that didn't really give me space or time to pursue these passions. If I was going to have any hope of growing in that practice, I needed to gather with other facilitators and sense makers to discuss, share, and collaborate. The institution wasn't going to help me out here, and why would they? My Air Force specialty code says nothing about facilitation, design thinking, writing, or innovation, or complexity theory, or any of that stuff I have a deep passion and talent for. When I found myself needing that environment and community, not just for defense innovation, but specifically for the art and practice of facilitated sense-making, my mind went straight for not the institutional form, but the community form. What David Ronfelt refers to as the tribal form, something I wrote about in my chapter of the Deaf book that came out recently, supported by synchronous engagement and emergent relational sense-making, not rigid structures and written policies and predetermined roles. It should be telling that we only succeeded in creating this space because of COVID, because the institution was suppressed in its capacity to control us. It wasn't the institution that held space for this. It was a global pandemic that tragically killed millions. I'm not pro-pandemic, by the way. We shouldn't require catastrophe to create space for us or the change we need. We launched Agitare with a simple gathering. Just a group of people sharing what they're doing with facilitation, what they're hoping to do, just connecting, bonding, communicating, building together, and that was it. And Jer McCoy and the generous support of the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum helped us take those initial steps and have continued to sponsor resources that help us maintain this community. Since that first call, in the last 2.5 years, Agitare has grown and experimented and evolved, but even as its size and reach has increased, we still haven't attempted to transition to the institutional form. We have resisted that at every suggestion, and there have been many suggestions. It is still a community on the semi-synchronous Slack workspace and in synchronous gatherings, seeking out signals from one another for when it's time to practice and explore together, swarming organically in response to requests from the community for support or engagement. And when it grows quiet, because everyone's energy gets drawn back by the institutions that control how much space we have in our lives, and because of everything else they have going on. We don't try and force or coerce or use preset roles to try and compel anybody to continue to put energy in. We've held facilitation and sense-making courses designed and executed entirely by volunteers who just want to share these competencies and get their chops up through practice. Our LinkedIn page has surpassed 1,000 followers, but I've never done that thing where you invite people to follow it and they feel compelled or guilty if they ignore it. I can be assured that what is done out of a sense that it's worth doing, not because we put on paper that it was someone's obligation to do it. All action is in response to the voices that we hold space for. And we hold no space for the voice of the institution, whereas most organizations hold space for nothing but the voice of the institution. Agitare is a radical experiment in emergent strategy, to borrow a term from Adrienne Marie Brown. It is an organic thing that may die if the community recedes too much for too long. But I'd rather that happen than that its hollow institutional husk continue on beyond the time that it creates the value for and from individuals that it was originally intended to. And I'm not anticipating that it will die soon, by the way. There is still a lot of energy there. I just mean a truly organic thing eventually dies. And the only way to make it immortal is to transform it into something that's not exactly alive in the same kind of way. And that's not how we're doing this thing. And I think that's part of what makes it special for all involved. It's not transactional, it's relational. Agitare's name is a Latin word that can mean the following things depending on context: to stir up, excite, disquiet, provoke, or agitate; to urge, drive, or impel; to hunt, chase; pursue, to guide or shepherd; to deliberate, discuss, debate, meditate upon. Facilitation is the art of responding dynamically to what is emerging within a social operating system. Sometimes we agitate or urge. Sometimes we pursue or chase. Sometimes we shepherd, and sometimes we foster debate or investigate or hold space for meditative, quiet reflection. It is the modulation of relationships between agents, creating conditions for something emergent and complex, something relational that transcends what roles we've been given or place on one another. As a space for those who facilitate, whether they've been officially granted that label or not, we facilitate the space that is Agitare. It is the unexpected emergent product of the complex, fertile estuary that is the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum, a liminal space that is not rigidly role-based or overly constrained, where I found room to define myself rather than being limited by the definitions that others had placed on me, compelled as they were by institutions. Consider for yourselves applying a facilitated, complex ecosystem approach to the social operating systems that you're hoping to see more from. It might mean opening them up to the threat of awkward silences, which, by the way, have a lot to say, or the unfortunate mortality that comes from being a living thing rather than something artificial. But we wouldn't wish our loved ones to gain immortality at the expense of their vitality, which is the source of their capacity for relationality. I'd like to make it very clear to those who seem to think that Agitare is the result of my heroic efforts. Let's disabuse ourselves of the great person theory of history. Agitare is the outcome of a networked relational convergence, and I just happen to be its most visible catalyst and champion. Let's shift instead to what my friend Austin Wiggins coined the great network theory. We don't need innovation heroes. We need people who can facilitate emergent effects in networks of people. So here's an incomplete snapshot of some of the pieces of this verdant and evolving ecosystem from which Agitare emerged. Thanks ever so much to DEF and the Agitare community for keeping me vital and passionate and engaged and growing for these last few years. A particular shout out to Austin Wiggins, Marcus Carrion, Christopher Williams, Michael Harbin, Philip Berry, Stephen Ogie, Jordan Fetter, Jason Toga True, Dustin Thomas, Karen Petty-Holt, Jerry McCoy, Trish Martinelli, Mike Madrid, Sarah Mills, everyone at the Centers for Adaptive Warfighting, the volunteers at DEF, our fishbowl speakers, all of whose talks you can see on the Agitare YouTube channel, my friends from the Joint Special Operations University and Solve Next and Summer of Design and Air Force CyberWorks, the champions within the institution who created and held space for me and others to put our time and energy and effort into something that the institution didn't understand or value. People like Robert Slaughter and Bill Waynick, everyone who took us up on our offer to host free training on facilitation and design in the Discovery 101 course, which we've now taught 8 iterations of. Everyone who made it to our design education showcase, to our Overcoming Bureaucracy event, which was initiated on Quarantine University on Facebook, and the countless others from inside and outside the permeable walls of Agitare to join us for events, recordings, and who are continuing to take bold steps to try things within the Air Force, the DoD, the government, and across the world. Experiments that have enough life to be vulnerable to death, even before they've had an impact, but always have an impact on those who put energy into them. Experiments like the team of facilitators who recently took on a massive event for Air Education and Training Command's Chief Learning Officer, Wendy Walsh, to explore current and potential connections mapping the relationality of the Air Force learning ecosystem, led by Marcus Carrion and joined by facilitators from various disciplines like Lego Serious Play, Systems Thinking, Design Warfare, Strategic Foresight, Liberating Structures, Think Wrong, and more. We are framework agnostic and endlessly curious. I'm excited to say I don't know what to expect next. That's the beauty of a truly complex and organic ecosystem. It isn't strictly roadmapped or constrained to particular outputs. Like a human being with countless potential and hidden depths, it can't be rigidly predefined or categorized any more than I could when I joined the Air Force, and they made an attempt. We don't aim for outputs only to create the conditions, the substrate and scaffolding and relationships for people to bring their whole selves to Agitare and hold space for them to determine what's possible when they're finally tapping into their actual potential. Thank you.